was a measurable, undeniable economic and cultural phenomenon. Forbes had already named her to the 30 Under 30 Asia list. Her personal endorsements were climbing toward $3 million for the year. She was on track to become the Philippines' highest-earning tennis player of all time in 2026. And the companies that understood the global marketplace, the ones with eyes on Asia's billion-dollar sports economy, they were watching very carefully. None more carefully than Nike. Here's where the story starts getting interesting. Nike didn't just want to sign Alex Ila. They wanted to make a statement. When she visited their world headquarters in Oregon in February of 2026, they didn't treat it like a routine business meeting. They treated it like a coronation. Posters documenting the defining moments of her career covered the walls. A special shirt had been designed in her honor, drawing inspiration from the sampaguita, the national flower of the Philippines, a gesture that was clearly meant to communicate something deeply personal. Along the famous tunnel at Nike headquarters, the one lined with portraits of the greatest global ambassadors the brand has ever partnered with, Ila's own face looked back at her. Beneath it, 4 words: history in full bloom. Special edition shoes had been put on display. The entire space had been curated, almost like a museum dedicated to her story so far. And the message couldn't have been clearer if they'd written it in giant letters across the Oregon sky. Nike wasn't approaching her as a young prospect they wanted to develop. They were approaching her as a generational talent they were desperate to lock down before someone else did. The offer they put on the table reflected exactly that. $75 million. 10 years. One of the richest endorsement deals ever offered to a tennis player, male or female. For context, Ila had earned just $876,000 in career prize money at that point. What Nike was offering would be over 85 times that amount, in a single contract, before she'd ever hit another ball in competition. For a 21-year-old from Quezon City, the kind of offer that would make most people's hands shake just reading the number on the page. Now pause here for a second. Because this is the part of the story where most people would assume they already know what comes next. Young player, massive offer, signs on the dotted line, life is changed forever, end of story. That's the script that's been played out 1,000 times before. The athlete as grateful recipient. The corporation as gracious benefactor. The deal as fairy tale ending. But Alex Ila hadn't come this far by following anyone else's script. Something wasn't right. And despite the red carpet, despite the custom shirts and the custom shoes and her own face staring back at her from a legendary hall of athletic greatness, she felt it the moment she started reading the fine print. Sources close to the negotiations have since described the specific nature of Ila's concerns in some detail. The contract, as presented, wasn't just asking for her time or her name or her likeness in the traditional sense. It was asking for control. The level of ownership Nike wanted over her public image went far beyond what she was comfortable with. There were restrictions on other endorsement deals that would have severely limited her ability to partner with brands that mattered to her personally and culturally. The way the contract was structured, according to people familiar with the talks, it wasn't designed to feel like a partnership. It was designed to feel like an acquisition. And there's a meaningful difference between those two things. Ila had actually been with Nike since 2019. She'd worn their gear through every milestone of her career. When she made her Wimbledon debut in 2025, Nike had sent her a personalized ensemble complete with a hair tie featuring the sampaguita, along with a handwritten note that read, "Every dream begins as a seed, and what you plant, you'll one day reap," a Filipina on the grass courts of history, not just playing for herself, but carrying a nation in full bloom. That note wasn't nothing. That gesture wasn't nothing. She had trusted this brand. She had believed that the relationship was built on genuine mutual respect. But trust, as she would later demonstrate she understood better than almost anyone in that negotiation room, is not a one-way street. And sitting there in Oregon, surrounded by carefully arranged celebrations of her heritage, she began to wonder whether all of it, the sampaguita shirt, the inspirational tunnel, the history in full bloom poster, was genuine partnership or incredibly sophisticated salesmanship. Whether it was love or leverage. She decided, quietly and without drama, that she wasn't willing to find out the hard way. She said no. Not with anger. Not with a press release. She simply, decisively, walked away from $75 million. And then the real story began. The reaction from Nike was not graceful. That much is now clear from multiple accounts of what happened in the days that followed. The executives who had orchestrated that elaborate welcome, who had personally selected those career posters and commissioned that custom shirt and hung her portrait in that tunnel, were stunned at first, and then furious. This wasn't just a business setback for them. Nike had positioned Ela as a cornerstone of their strategy for the Asian market, a market worth billions and growing fast. The Philippines alone has a population of over 110 million people. The broader Southeast Asian sports apparel market was one of the most aggressively contested in the world. Ela wasn't just a tennis player to Nike's strategic planners. She was a key that unlocked a door to an enormous commercial territory. When she walked away, they didn't just lose a spokesperson. They lost a strategy. And corporations at that level of power and financial reach don't absorb that kind of loss quietly. Within days, according to sources inside both organizations, Nike's leadership began directing pressure not just at Ela herself, but at the Women's Tennis Association, the governing body that oversees the women's professional tour. The message that landed on the WTA's doorstep was blunt and barely disguised as anything diplomatic. If the WTA could not ensure that players Nike wanted to sponsor were being properly supported, properly promoted, and properly positioned for commercial success, then Nike would be reconsidering its multi-million-dollar sponsorship commitments to the tour. Full stop. Let that land for a moment. One of the most powerful brands on the planet, furious over being told no by a 21-year-old athlete, was now essentially threatening the entire organizational infrastructure of women's professional tennis. Not because the WTA had done anything wrong. Not because there had been a contractual dispute or a scheduling conflict or a code of conduct violation, but because one player, one person, had exercised her right to decline a business offer she found unacceptable. The audacity of that move is almost hard to fully process. But it happened. And the WTA suddenly found itself standing in the middle of a conflict that it hadn't asked for and had no obvious way out of. The meetings between Nike executives and WTA officials in the days and weeks that followed were, by all accounts, extraordinarily tense. The demands Nike put forward went well beyond anything that could have been described as a reasonable business conversation. They wanted more showcase court assignments for Ela at major tournaments. They wanted favorable scheduling that would maximize her television exposure. They reportedly floated the idea of creating special exemptions for players who generated exceptional commercial interest, essentially asking the WTA to rewrite its operational rules around the commercial preferences of a corporate sponsor. For the WTA, the bind was genuinely painful. Nike wasn't a minor sponsor. Nike's financial involvement in the women's tour was significant, touching everything from tournament operations to player development infrastructure. Losing that support wasn't an abstract concern. It was a real threat to the functioning of the organization. But the alternative, bending to the demands of a corporation that wanted to dictate court assignments and scheduling based on who they decided to invest in commercially, would have set a precedent so dangerous that it could have fundamentally changed the nature of the sport. One senior WTA official, speaking anonymously, put it as plainly as anyone could: "We were caught between a global corporation and a player who just proved she can't be bought." There was no playbook for this. And into this already combustible situation came another layer of controversy that poured fuel directly onto the fire. Reports surfaced suggesting that several high-profile media figures had taken public shots at Ela that were difficult to interpret as anything other than gatekeeping. Questions were raised, openly and on national television platforms, about whether a player from a tennis-developing nation like the Philippines should realistically be offered that level of financial commitment. There were suggestions, made by commentators with very large audiences, that Ela's rapid rise was connected more to her demographic profile and marketability than to her actual talent and competitive ability. These weren't whispered criticisms. They were broadcast, discussed, dissected. And they revealed something that the numbers, the stadium crowds and the viewership figures and the Forbes listings had already been quietly exposing for a while: that there existed in the tennis world, and in the broader media world surrounding it, a persistent and stubborn reluctance to accept that greatness of this magnitude could come from the Philippines. That a girl from Quezon City could be worth what the market, by its own cold financial logic, was clearly saying she was worth. Manny Pacquiao, the Filipino boxing legend whose own battles with that kind of dismissal had made him a symbol of national pride, expressed his admiration for Ela publicly. He knew something about being told you didn't belong in a room before making yourself impossible to ignore. Serena Williams, who had spent decades facing her own version of those gatekeeping conversations, fired back in defense of Hila without hesitation. Venus Williams, who understood better than almost anyone what it meant to have your value questioned despite the evidence, offered her support. And in the middle of all of it, with corporations leveraging financial threats and media personalities questioning her worth and the governing body of her sport caught in a crisis partly of her own making, Alex Hila did something that the tennis world probably should have expected by now, given everything she had already shown people about who she was. She spoke. 4 words. Short, simple, and so precisely chosen that they cut through every layer of noise and landed somewhere that statistics and sponsorship figures couldn't quite reach. My roots are my strength, not my weakness. That was it. That was the whole statement. And it hit harder than anything else said about this situation by anyone with far more words at their disposal. Because what those 4 words communicated wasn't just defiance. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when a person knows exactly who they are and has made peace with every part of it, including the parts that the powerful people in the room have tried to use against them. It reframed the entire narrative in a single breath. The conversation had been, in so many subtle and not so subtle ways, about whether her roots were a limitation. Whether coming from the Philippines, from a country without a Grand Slam pedigree, from a city that most tennis broadcast producers couldn't have found on a map 5 years ago, whether all of that was something she needed to overcome or transcend or apologize for. And she answered that conversation by saying, "You have the whole thing backwards." She wasn't despite her roots. She was because of them. Now, here's the question that's been hanging over everything since this story broke, and it's one that honest people can reasonably disagree on. Was this the bravest decision in modern tennis history? Or was it the most costly mistake of her career? The case for bravery is straightforward and, frankly, compelling. Hila didn't just reject a contract. She rejected a relationship of ownership dressed up as partnership. She looked at a deal that would have made her financially secure for generations, that would have put her face everywhere, that would have made her one of the most recognized athletes on the planet, and she said, "Not like this. Not on these terms. Not if the cost is the kind of control over my image and my identity that I'm not willing to give up." That takes something. That takes a level of self-knowledge and groundedness that is genuinely rare, especially at 21, especially when the number on the table has that many zeros in it. And what she got in return.